Every look the man them look on woman them would have spend 1 grand, 2 grand. Spend per woman, rude boy, you can't wrong. So long as you treat her right. All girls, the man them would have spend amount of money forget the gal them goody good. Cause the all them look so sweet and them body shape so good. Man a spend amount of money forget the gal them goody good. Cause the all them look so sweet and them body shape so good. All them look so good. Gal them in my neighborhood. All them look so good. Gal them shoulda they ya Hollywood. All them look so good. The gal them from round a cane hood. All them look so good. The gal them from round a Harwood. All them look so good. The shape a make them make touch full wide. Trophy your body shape half full. Oh she look so good. She keep her body fit as she should. Man a spend amount of money forget the gal them goody good. Cause the all them look so sweet and them body shape so good. Spend amount of money forget the gal them goody good. Cause the all them look so sweet and them body shape so good. All part pan the woman them body look good. Them hip, them waist can scream you smell good. With the cute face you have the work of the thing look good. Me want your muggle pan you make because she can't look good. Cock up your bum by your man have to treat you good. Do the booger dance and move as you should. Man a spend amount of money forget the gal them goody good. Cause the all them look so sweet and them body shape so chop. Spend amount of money forget the gal them goody good. Cause the all them look so sweet and them body shape so good. Not tell a lie. Over the woman if some man woulda die them woulda spend pan down to the pocket and try woman your possess the good. No man you not tie, but sometimes you have to ask the question why only him a spend. I can't get a try. I show him a fold them a bring out the guy woman dance and maggle make the man them cry over your goody good good. Them woulda tell to your lie. She get some money, fi come get a try. That's why the man them woulda spend amount of money fi get the gal them goody good. That's all them look so sweet and them body shape so good. Spend amount of money fi get the gal them goody good. That's all them look so sweet and them body shape so good. All them look so good. England girls them have the goody good. All them look so good. Canadian girls them have the good good. All them look so good. New York girls them have the goody good. All them look so good. Miami girls them carry the good good. All them look so good. Parkland girls them have the goody good. All them look so good. Washington girls them have the good. All them look so good. Lad, the gal look too half full. Man, I spend amount of money to get the gal them goody good. Cause all them look so sweet and them body shape so. Spend amount of money to get the gal them goody good. Cause all them look so sweet and them body shape so good. All them look so good. Gal them in my neighborhood. All them look so good. Gal you shoulda they ya Hollywood. All them look so good. The shape a make you make the gut full wide. Trophy your body shape half full. All them look so good. They keep them body fit as them should. Man, I spend amount of money to get the gal them goody good. Cause all them look so sweet and them body shape so good. Spend amount of money to get the gal them goody good. Cause all them look so sweet and them body shape so good. All part pan the woman them body look good. Them hip, them waist can scream you smell good.